My aunt told the family, I took Grandma's will and destroyed it, now everything goes to me. I thought she won until the lawyer smiled and said, actually she made a video will. My aunt's smirk vanished instantly. I still remember the way my aunt sat there all smug, like she had just won the lottery. The whole family had gathered in the lawyer's office, thinking we were there for a simple reading of my grandmother's will. My grandma had passed a few weeks prior, and while we were all grieving, there was this unspoken tension in the air because of her. My Aunt Diane, she had always been the type to think she was the smartest person in the room, and honestly, up until that moment, she had most of us fooled. We were all seated around the long mahogany table in Mr. Calloway's office. He was my grandmother's lawyer, a sharp old man with a face like he'd seen too much in his years. The room smelled like old books and polished wood, and even though the AC was running, I felt a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. Diane sat at the head of the table, back straight, hands folded like she was the damn queen. My mom sat to my left, twisting a tissue between her fingers, eyes red from crying. My uncle sat across from me, arms crossed so tightly his knuckles turned white. My cousins were all there too, some staring at their hands, others giving Diane the side eye, but no one said a word. Then Mr. Calloway cleared his throat. As you all know, we're here to go over your mother's final wishes. His voice was even, but something in his tone made me sit up a little straighter. That's when Diane spoke. And when I say she spoke, I mean she announced, like she had been waiting for this moment her whole life. There is no will, she said, voice dripping with satisfaction. Silence. We all just stared at her, confused. Even Mr. Calloway frowned. What do you mean? My uncle finally asked, his voice tight. Diane gave this slow, exaggerated shrug, like she was explaining something to a bunch of idiots. I mean exactly what I said. Mom wrote a will, but I found it, and I destroyed it. I swear the whole room shifted. My mom let out this small gasp. My uncle's jaw clenched so hard I thought his teeth might crack. My cousins exchanged looks, their eyes wide. Mr. Calloway, though, he didn't look surprised. If anything, he looked almost amused. Diane kept going. Since there's no will, everything automatically goes to the next of kin. That's me. She smiled like she had already won. I was her primary caretaker, she lived with me, so legally, everything is mine now. I felt sick. My grandmother had been clear about what she wanted. She had told us all. She wanted her house split between my mom and uncle. She wanted her savings divided among her grandchildren. She even had specific things she wanted certain people to have, her jewelry, her antique furniture, the wedding ring she always wore. She had it all written down, and Diane had burned it. My mom was shaking now, her eyes filling with tears. You had no right, she whispered. Diane just shrugged again. Doesn't matter, it's gone. You can be as mad as you want, but legally it's over. Everything's mine. She leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, looking like a cat that just swallowed a whole flock of canaries. That's when Mr. Calloway did something I'll never forget. He smiled. It wasn't a big smile, just the corners of his mouth turning up slightly, but it was enough to make Diane's expression falter. Actually, he said, flipping open a folder, your mother was quite thorough. Diane's smirk twitched. What are you talking about? Mr. Calloway pulled out a USB drive and placed it on the table. It was small, unremarkable, but at that moment, it might as well have been a grenade. Your mother made a video will. The room went dead silent. Diane's face drained of color. She opened her mouth, then shut it again. My uncle let out a breath, half a laugh, half disbelief. My mom clutched my arm, eyes wide, like she wasn't sure if she was dreaming. I have here a recorded video of your mother stating, in her own words, how she wanted her assets distributed, Mr. Calloway continued, completely unfazed by the sheer panic now radiating off my aunt. It was signed and witnessed by two neutral parties, and since it is legally binding in this state, he leaned back in his chair, looking directly at Diane. Your little stunt means absolutely nothing. Diane's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. You're lying, she said, but there was no confidence in her voice anymore. Mr. Calloway didn't even bother responding. Instead, he reached for his laptop, plugged in the USB drive, and turned the screen toward us. Then he pressed play. And there she was, my grandmother, sitting in her favorite chair, wearing that soft blue sweater she always loved, looking right into the camera with that no-nonsense expression she always had when she meant business. If you're watching this, she said, then my daughter Diane has probably tried some nonsense. I swear. My uncle choked on a laugh. Diane's hands were shaking now. Grandma continued, I made this video because I know my daughter, and I know she thinks she's the smartest person in the room. But let me be clear, my will is final. And if you've destroyed the paper copy, don't worry, I planned for that. Diane actually pushed back from the table, like she could physically escape this moment. Grandma began listing everything. The house, split between my mom and uncle, the savings divided among her grandchildren, the heirlooms going exactly where she had intended. And then she got to Diane. As for my daughter Diane, Grandma said, her voice turning sharp, I leave her exactly one thing, a reminder that greed will get you nowhere. Silence. The room was thick with tension, like the air had been sucked out. Diane looked like she was going to be sick. And Mr. Calloway? He just folded his hands and said, well, that settles that. But oh, it wasn't over, because Diane, desperate, panicked, realizing her whole scheme had just crumbled before her eyes, did something even more insane. And that's where things really got interesting. For a moment, nobody moved. The only sound in the room was the faint of the air conditioning. My grandmother's voice still lingered in the air, her words hitting Diane like a freight train. Then, like a switch flipped, Diane shot up from her chair so fast that it nearly toppled over. This is fake, she stammered, pointing at the laptop. She was old. She didn't know what she was saying. Mr. Calloway didn't even blink. The video was recorded in the presence of 2 witnesses, both of whom signed legal documents confirming her full mental capacity at the time. He leaned back in his chair, his expression almost bored. So no, Diane, this is not fake. Diane's eyes darted around the room looking for support, but no one was on her side. My uncle was glaring at her with a mix of disgust and rage. My mom had tears in her eyes, but now they weren't from sadness, they were from pure relief. My cousins all had their jaws on the floor, some whispering to each other. Me? I was just watching it all unfold, gripping the edge of the table so hard my knuckles turned white. Then Diane did what Diane always did when things didn't go her way. She doubled down. This is a conspiracy, she spat, crossing her arms. You all just want to steal what's mine. I was the one who took care of Mom. My uncle, who had been quiet up until now, suddenly let out a short, bitter laugh. You took care of her? You mean you stuck her in the back room and treated her like an inconvenience? Diane whipped around to face him, her face red. I was the only one there. Because you wouldn't let anyone else visit, my mom shot back, her voice shaking. You always had an excuse. Oh, she's resting. Oh, she's not feeling well. But you were just isolating her, weren't you? So you could do whatever you wanted without anyone finding out. Diane's face twisted. That's not true. Oh, it's true, I muttered, not even realizing I had spoken out loud. She turned to me then, her expression sharp. What the hell do you know? I stood up slowly, my heart pounding. I know that Grandma called me 3 weeks before she died. That shut her up. Her eyes widened slightly. What? Yeah, I said, my voice steady now. She called me, out of nowhere. Said she'd got lucky because you were out running errands and she finally had time to talk. I took a step closer. And do you know what she told me? Diane didn't answer. She told me she was scared of you. My mom let out a small gasp. My uncle's hands curled into fists. My cousins all turned to look at Diane, their faces a mix of horror and disgust. Diane shook her head rapidly. No, she didn't. She did, I interrupted. She said you were taking her money. Said she wasn't allowed to leave the house unless you were with her. Said you yelled at her when she asked too many questions about her own bank account. Diane's whole body went stiff. Her breathing was shallow now, her eyes darting to the door like she was thinking about making a run for it. That's when Mr. Calloway cleared his throat again. And that, he said, is exactly why we're not done here. Diane turned back to him sharply. What are you talking about? Mr. Calloway pulled out another folder, much thicker than the first. He flipped it open, adjusted his glasses and started reading. Prior to her passing, your mother came to me with concerns about financial exploitation. She requested a full audit of her accounts, and wouldn't you know it, tens of thousands of dollars were missing. The blood drained from Diane's face. Lies, she whispered. Mr. Calloway kept going, completely unfazed. Now, at first we thought she had simply misplaced the funds. But upon further investigation, we found multiple transfers leading directly to, well, would you like to guess? Silence. Then my uncle spoke, his voice low. Diane? Mr. Calloway nodded. Bingo. The withdrawal started small, 500 here, 1,000 there, but they added up. Over the course of 2 years, you drained nearly $80,000 from your mother's savings. Someone cursed under their breath. Diane's hands were shaking now. No, she told me to take that money. Did she? Mr. Calloway asked, tilting his head. Because we have something else. He reached into the folder and pulled out another piece of paper. Then he slid it across the table toward Diane. She didn't move to take it. I leaned over slightly and read the heading. It was a police report. My stomach dropped. Your mother filed this report 2 weeks before she passed, Mr. Calloway continued. She stated that she believed you were stealing from her, that you had access to her debit cards, that you were forging her signature on checks. She even gave the officer specific dates and transactions. Diane's mouth opened, but no words came out. And, Mr. Calloway said, flipping to the next page, we have security footage from her bank confirming that you were the one making those withdrawals. Diane took a step back, then another. Her hands were shaking so badly now that she clenched them into fists to stop it. This is ridiculous, she finally forced out. You can't prove, Mr. Calloway held up a hand. Actually we can, and we have, and as of this morning the police have reopened the case." Diane froze. A cold, horrible silence filled the room. Then a loud knock on the office door. The air in my lungs turned to stone. Mr. Calloway didn't even look surprised. He just sighed, closed the folder and said, "Ah." Right on time. The door opened, and in walked two uniformed police officers. Diane's breath hitched a mess. "Diane Reynolds?" one of the officers said. She didn't answer. "You're under arrest for financial exploitation, elder abuse and fraud." And just like that, the queen of the room, the woman who thought she had outsmarted us all, the woman who sat at the head of the table like she owned the world, was handcuffed right in front of us. She started screaming, cursing, thrashing against their grip, but there was nothing she could do. And as they dragged her out of the office, her face red with fury, her voice hoarse from screaming, I couldn't help but think about what my grandmother had said in her video. "Greed will get you nowhere." She was right. And now? Diane was about to learn that the hard way. Diane's screams echoed down the hall as the officers dragged her out of the office. The rest of us sat there frozen, watching her world collapse. For years she had controlled everything: Grandma's house, her money, her access to the outside world. She had isolated her, manipulated her, and stolen from her. And now she was being hauled off like the criminal she was. But here's the thing. It wasn't over. Not even close. Because just as I was starting to breathe again, just as I thought we had finally won, Mr. Calloway cleared his throat once more. "There's one more thing." I turned to look at him, my stomach tightening. Diane was gone. The police had taken her. What else could there possibly be? My mom wiped her eyes and shook her head. "Please," she whispered, "no more surprises." Mr. Calloway sighed. "I wish that were the case, but I need you all to see something." He opened another folder and pulled out a thick stack of documents. The pages looked old, yellowed at the edges, like they had been sitting in a drawer for decades. Then he dropped them on the table. The title at the top made my heart stop. "Deed to Property, Transfer of Ownership." My uncle leaned forward, squinting. "What the hell is this?" Mr. Calloway slid the papers toward us. "This is proof that your grandmother never actually owned her house." Silence. The words didn't make sense at first. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He folded his hands. "I mean that technically, legally, your grandmother never owned the house outright. It was in her parents' name when she lived there. When they passed, she assumed ownership, but he tapped the papers. They never finalized the transfer. The deed was never properly recorded." "Which means," the air in the room shifted. My uncle's face darkened. "Which means what, exactly?" Mr. Calloway took a deep breath. "Which means that decades ago, when your grandmother thought she was paying off her mortgage, she wasn't. The house still legally belonged to the bank." My mom clutched her chest. No, that's not possible. She paid for everything. That was her home." "It was," Mr. Calloway agreed. "But not on paper. And here's where things get even messier." He reached into the folder and pulled out one more document. A foreclosure notice, a fresh one, dated 2 weeks ago. The words on the page blurred as my vision swam. "What does this mean?" I asked. Mr. Calloway's face was grim. "It means that while we were all focused on Diane's fraud, the bank was finalizing their claim. The house isn't yours. It's not part of the estate." My mom gasped. "Are you saying they're going to take it?" Mr. Calloway sighed. "Not yet. But if we don't act fast, they will." My uncle slammed his fist on the table. "Jesus Christ. First Diane, now this?" I swallowed hard. "What can we do?" Mr. Calloway hesitated. "We have two options. One, we challenge it. We gather every document, every payment receipt your grandmother ever had, and fight it in court. But that could take years, and there's no guarantee we'd win. And the second option," my mom whispered. He looked at us carefully. "You buy the house at market value." My uncle swore under his breath. "That's not an option. You just said Diane drained $80 from Mom's accounts. That was her savings. We don't have that kind of money lying around." A heavy silence fell over us. For a moment, I thought that was it. That we were about to lose the house, the one thing Grandma had worked her whole life for. But then I remembered something. "Wait," I said, sitting up. "What about Diane?" Mr. Calloway frowned. "What about her?" I turned to my mom and uncle, my mind racing. "Diane stole money, right? And the police are charging her for it? That means if she's convicted, we can go after her assets." My uncle's eyes widened. "Holy shit." My mom blinked. "Are you saying?" I nodded. "We sue her. We take back every cent she stole. And if she spent it, well, she still has her own house, her car, her jewelry, and her retirement fund," Mr. Calloway added. "Which, as it turns out, she was funneling money into using your grandmother's accounts. That was it. That was the key. We weren't just going to get justice, we were going to ruin her." My uncle leaned back, a slow grin spreading across his face. "So, let me get this straight. We're going to use Diane's own stolen money to buy back Grandma's house?" Mr. Calloway nodded. "If you act fast?" "Yes." My mom exhaled shakily, then let out a watery laugh. Poetic justice, I smirked. Grandma would love this. And she would. Because in the end Diane didn't just lose, she lost everything. Diane thought she could steal everything from us. She thought she could cheat, lie and walk away rich while the rest of us were left with nothing. She was wrong. The moment we realized we could go after her money, things moved fast. My uncle and mom hired a lawyer that same week, and we sued Diane for every penny she stole. The case against her was strong between the forged checks, the bank records and the video will. There was no way out. The prosecution was relentless, and within 3 months Diane was convicted of elder abuse, financial fraud, and theft. She was sentenced to 6 years in prison. 6 years of sitting in a tiny cell, eating stale food, and wearing an ugly orange jumpsuit. But that was just the start. Once she was convicted, we filed a civil lawsuit to recover every cent she took. And guess what? We won. Diane was ordered to pay back every single dollar she stole plus damages. Of course she didn't have the money. She had spent most of it on herself, expensive clothes, luxury handbags, spa trips and other useless junk. But that didn't matter, because if she couldn't pay, her assets would be seized. And oh, did she have assets? Her house? Gone. Sold at auction. Her car? Repossessed. Her precious jewelry collection? Pawned off. Her retirement savings? Emptied to pay off what she owed us. Diane went from living in a big house and acting like she was better than everyone to sleeping on a prison cot with nothing to her name. Meanwhile, we used her stolen money to buy back Grandma's house. The same house Diane tried to claim as her own. The day we signed the final papers, my mom cried. My uncle hugged me so tight I could barely breathe. We walked through the house running our hands over the furniture, the walls, the kitchen counters, all the places Grandma had spent her life. We had one. But we weren't done yet. We saved one last act of revenge just for Diane. You see, Diane still had one last belonging that hadn't been taken from her yet, her precious storage unit. Before she went to prison, she had rented a storage space filled with things she thought she could hide from the courts. Designer bags, expensive shoes, personal documents, all of it. But she was too stupid to realize that when she failed to pay the rental fee, the storage unit got repossessed. And since my cousin happened to know the guy who managed the facility, we made sure Diane's entire storage unit was sold at a public auction to strangers for dirt cheap. Every last bit of her hidden treasures gone. The best part? Since Diane was in prison, she didn't even know it happened until it was too late. When she found out, she completely lost it. Screaming, threatening to sue us from prison, which was hilarious, considering she was broke, but there was nothing she could do. She stole from her own mother. She destroyed the will. She tried to steal from the entire family, and in the end, she lost everything. We got the house. We got justice. And Diane, she got exactly what she deserved. Grandma always said that greed will get you nowhere. And now, Diane had nowhere to go.